Our top story tonight. Well, we in India know that the main aim of the Khalistan movement is to carve out a separate homeland for Sikhs in Punjab. Let me get you a little history. Like most of the geopolitical crises that plague the world today, the Khalistan cause also finds its origin in the British colonial rule. The British wanted to divide Hindus and Sikhs, and so they recruited Sikh soldiers in large numbers and deployed them against Hindu rebellions. This divide deepened during the partition. Now, on Indian soil, this movement saw violence and bloodshed, assassinations, kidnappings and massacres of civilians in the 1980s and 90s. This, meanwhile, also had its repercussions in Canada, which was witnessing an influx of Sikhs after the partition and when the Khalistan movement was at its peak. Canadian journalist Terry Milewski documents in his book, Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project, that in 1982, the then Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, who also is Justin Trudeau's father, declined to extradite Talvinder Singh Parmar, a man who was accused of killing 2 police officers in Punjab and who, by the way, was also the mastermind of the worst terror attack on Canada in 1985. This Canadian response was criticized by India, but the aftermath of Operation Blue Star bolstered this movement among the diaspora members. Subsequently, the International Sikh Youth Federation and the Babbar Khalsa emerged in Britain, while the World Sikh Organization originated in Canada and the United States. Since then, the movement has only been fueled and spread across Canada, impacting its politics, social fabric, and now its foreign policy as well. Tonight we ask how and why the Khalistan movement has been able to sustain itself in Canada despite finding no takers here in India. I'm joined by guests tonight. Let me first introduce them on the panel. I'm joined by Mr. Anil Trigunayath, former ambassador. Dean Baxendale, publisher and columnist, CEO of the Optimum Publishing International, also joins us. Sardar Jyotjit Sabharwal, spokesperson for the BJP, joins us. And we're also joined by Phil Gurski, former Senior Terrorism Strategic Analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you very much for speaking with Mirror Now. Before I go to my other guests, let me first start with Mr. Phil Gurski. Mr. Phil, we've been hearing this from day one, that Justin Trudeau has been saying that there are credible allegations and credible reasons to believe that India has been involved in the killing of Nijjar. But we've never ever heard him speak about credible evidence. When can we expect that evidence to come out? Will that evidence be ever, seen or be at least, shared with the Indian government?
Of course, have no idea, as I no longer work for the Canadian government. I'll simply point out that under Canadian law, there is a very big distinction made between intelligence and evidence. Intelligence in Canada is collected by, for example, my former employer, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, but is not used in a court of law because it's not collected to what we call an evidentiary standard. In order for criminal charges to be laid in a court trial to pursue, you have to have actual evidence that's collected in accordance with Canadian law. So I don't know what the government's plans are going forward, but as somebody who worked in intelligence, you get very nervous when leaders start talking about intelligence in the public sphere because sources and methods can be affected if, in fact, people disclose that something was obtained from an intelligence source. But there is a very, very big distinction in Canada between intelligence and evidence. Not all countries treat it that way, but here in Canada we have since the creation of my service in 1984.
Okay, Mr. Gurski, there are also, of course, reports in the Canadian media that, Indian diplomats were under surveillance, and that is how this whole case came into light for the Justin Trudeau government. Uh, were Indian diplomats spied upon? Number one. Number two, is it that, easy for the Canadian intelligence to be able to spy on Indian officials there?
I have no idea whom is being spied upon or not in Canada. The organizations have their legislative mandates as to what they can do and what they cannot do under Canadian law. It's entirely possible, but I have nothing to suggest that they were or they weren't. All I know is that any efforts to obtain intelligence on Canadian soil or outside of Canada has rules in terms of what you can and cannot do. And those rules are very carefully outlined under Canadian law.
Okay, let me also, understand from you how the Canadian intelligence views the Khalistani movement and the Khalistani cause, Mr. Phil Gurski. Here in India, we know that, we see them as terrorists. The groups have been banned. But in Canada, the picture is entirely different. We have sympathizers and supporters of the Khalistan movement being supported publicly and overtly by the Canadian governments year after year. How does the Canadian intelligence really view these sympathizers of the Khalistani movement?
We have mechanisms here in Canada where we can list entities as terrorist entities. This has been a post 9/11 development. And it is my understanding that several groups are listed in Canada as terrorist entities with ties to the Sikh extremism movement. It's also important to point out that not everybody in Canada belongs to these movements, is a member of these movements, abides by the same goals as these movements, and we wouldn't want to, label everybody with the same name because that would be inaccurate. But it is true, and you pointed out in your introductory remarks, the single greatest attack in aviation terrorism history was planned from Canada, the Air India attack in 1985. That's a fact. We can't get around that. And it's also a fact that there probably are individuals here in Canada who still believe that violence is a necessary tactic to use to advance the goals of certain Sikh extremism movements.
All right. As somebody who has served in the Canadian intelligence, Mr. Gurski, have you had experiences while you were serving, experiences of dealing with such groups, with perhaps violent incidents that these groups and individuals were associated with? And how did the Canadian intelligence really deal with such situations if they ever emerged in the country?
As I mentioned, we have our mandates to investigate individuals and or groups that are threatening the use of violence for political, ideological, or religious ends, which is the definition of terrorist activity under the Canadian Criminal Code. The organization for which I work, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, treats terrorism under Section 2C of the CSIS Act, has the mandate to collect intelligence on anybody who will use violence to those means. But as I said, under Canadian law, intelligence is treated very differently from evidence. If these groups are involved in activity that may in fact be criminal or potentially criminal in nature, that becomes a law enforcement responsibility. And that is under the aegis of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, who must collect independently their own information, which is evidentiary in nature, which can be used in a Canadian criminal court. So we do separate intelligence from evidence very carefully in this country because they're collected to different standards. And as somebody who worked in intelligence, you don't want your sources and methods from an intelligence perspective to be aired in public view because that will affect your ability to collect information in the future.
So are you saying, Mr. Gurski, that, if we go by what Justin Trudeau is saying, that he has some sort of, intelligence, which is by which he's going by and, hurling these allegations at India, does that mean that, the work of the intelligence agencies ends here and this is where the law enforcement agencies will start conducting their investigation?
Not necessarily. Even if a particular case takes a criminal turn, and as I said, that would be police responsibility, law enforcement here in Canada, the security services can still do their own investigations at a different level to monitor perhaps other individuals or groups who may share similar attitudes or similar plans. Just because one particular group is being focused on in this particular regard doesn't mean that you can't look at others. And that's sort of the way it works here in Canada, is that a particular case may be handed on to law enforcement, meaning the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but that does not prevent the security service, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, from continuing similar investigations against other individuals who may in fact pose a threat to public safety and national security because of the possibility of the use of violence for the aforementioned religious, ideological, or political causes.
Okay. There's also, while doing my research on this, Mr. Gurski, I happened to chance upon this book, which has been co-authored by Michel Junot-Katsu and his colleague, who are both military intelligence officials, former military intelligence officials from Canada. And in their book, they talk about an operation called the Dragon Lord, where they accuse the US of running a secret probe into the security threats posed by Chinese activities in Canada. And I bring this into this context because, here too, there's an American angle which is being leaked, which is being thrown about in various media reports. What are your thoughts on that?
Canada is very fortunate to belong to the aforementioned Five Eyes Security Alliance, which, as you said, includes the Australians, the Americans, the British, and the New Zealanders, along with us here in Canada. It is the gold standard of intelligence alliances in human history. A lot of very sensitive information is shared amongst those partners. And those of us who worked in intelligence get very nervous when officials decide to disclose publicly the nature of some of that intelligence, because as I said earlier, intelligence that is leaked publicly can lead to the disappearance of sources and methods. The government can do what the government wants. I mean, we provide the government with intelligence to make better decisions and make better policies. We explain to governments the sensitivity of the information so that it is not compromised. But at the end of the day, once the information is out of your hands and is given to somebody else, they can decide to do with that whatever they wish, and you have no control over that. But as somebody who spent as long as I did in intelligence, it's a very nervous day when you hear political officials citing intelligence because you realize that that could have an adverse effect on your ability to collect intelligence in the future.
Yeah. Which is what leads me to my next question, Mr. Gurski. Do you think that Justin Trudeau would make such a move as to, if not, of course, we're not expecting him to divulge all the details of the intelligence that he has received, but, talk about it a bit in public eye. Do you have that fear?
I don't speak for the Prime Minister. I don't know what's going through his mind. There could be all kinds of considerations that he has in order to make a statement of this nature. It is my hope as a former intelligence security official that he thought about this very carefully before he went public with it. But, when trying to understand the reasons why he chose to do this, you'd have to ask Justin Trudeau yourself. There may be other things that I'm not aware of that he elected to do in this case to bolster the types of allegations he's making. But I just, I get very nervous when I hear intelligence being shared publicly in the way that he did in recent days.
Okay. Okay, my last question to you, Mr. Gurski, the likes of Talvinder Singh Parmar, Canada has seen, he's been involved in one of the biggest terror attacks in Canada. You've had a lot of Canadians lose their lives in that attack. But you also have the political leadership walking shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand with the Khalistani sympathizers. How do you see the Khalistan movement really panning out in Canada? Because here in India, we don't have very many takers of this cause, of this so-called cause and so-called movement. But in Canada, we do see that support.
I'll be careful here because I'm not a specialist on the Khalistani movement. It's not something, I'm more of an Islamist extremism specialist. That's what I worked in my time. But what I think happens amongst diaspora communities, and this obtains around the world, is diaspora communities often hold on to causes beyond the time in which the people back home decide that to no longer spend so much effort and energy on whatever grievance they have. It seems to me historically that people who move to another country, either fleeing persecution or for a better life or whatever, will often advance the causes of those movements far beyond the time where the people back home have simply decided to move on. So again, I don't want to go into any more details because, as I said, I'm not a specialist on the Khalistani movement. But as you pointed out, 40 years ago,
Okay.
it was a very serious threat to public safety and national security, resulting in the bombing of Air India. And it is highly possible, although again, I don't have any details or knowledge to make anything stronger than that, that there are individuals within the Sikh community here, which is very large, by the way. I've seen estimates of around 700,000 people who may think that perhaps the use of
Yeah.
violence is still merited in order to achieve the particular goals that certain Sikhs, and I think it's a very small number of people in Canada, that certain Sikhs may think that this is still a valid way to
Hmm.
get the results that they are seeking.
All right, Mr. Phil Gurski, appreciate you joining us on Mirror Now and sharing your perspective. Thank you very much for joining us tonight and speaking on the India-Canada turmoil that both the countries are going through.